We'll just wait a couple of minutes to let people join. Maybe just till 2 minutes past and then we'll start. Okay, I'll just start with a karakia. Aio ki te rangi, aio ki te whenua, aio ki te katoa, haume huie tai ki. Wow, welcome to this very final Deep South webinar. My name's Anita Wreford. I've been leading the Impacts and Implications program of the Deep South National Science Challenge for the last 6 or so years. And I'm based at Lincoln University, sunny Lincoln, as you can see in the background. Unfortunately, it's not. But yeah, I'm really delighted to host this webinar, and thank you very much for joining, on decision making under uncertainty. This was a theme that we funded several projects on over the last few years, and I think it's so important so that we can understand better ways to make decisions despite the inherent uncertainty involved in climate change. We still hear decision makers asking what scenario should I use, which model should I go with, and really there are a lot of ways that allow you to make decisions across a range of those futures, because we really have no way of knowing what the future is going to look like. And so today we've got 3 people who are taking some different approaches to addressing this question of uncertainty, decision making despite uncertainty. And in these talks, we really want to focus on what will help you decision makers on the ground planning for adaptation for climate change and hopefully beginning to implement it as well. So we've got 3 speakers today. We've got Tom Logan from the University of Canterbury, Graeme Guthrie, who's an independent academic, and Andrew Allison from NIWA. And I'll introduce them all a bit more in detail when their time comes. But Tom's going to give an overview of a piece of work that we commissioned to really give a summary of the kinds of approaches that are available out there, and when and how, which ones are appropriate in which context, and how they can be applied. So I will pass over to Tom in a second. I'll just tell you a little bit more about him first, though. He's at the University of Canterbury and studies the risk to and resilience of urban systems with a focus on transforming how we design our cities in the face of climate change. He uses risk science, systems engineering, modelling and statistics to consider how our cities and towns might adapt. So each of our speakers will have 10 minutes. Tom, I'll give you a nod if you're going over time. I'll put my hand up or something. And then there'll be 5 minutes immediately after each speaker to ask them questions directly on their talk. And then hopefully, if everyone keeps to time, there'll be time at the end for a wider discussion. So I will pass over to you now, Tom.
All right. Hopefully you can both hear me and see my screen. Cool. All right. So yeah, thank you, Anita. Kia ora koutou. So as I guess everyone who's here is probably well aware, climate adaptation requires us planning around spatial and temporal uncertainty and variation. And one of the natural or one of the most apparent sources of uncertainty is just around the climate change. And I've, funnily enough, used the word projections here, and what I mean to use is the word scenarios, because I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. There's big uncertainty around what climate change is going to bring, both in terms of the temperature rise and then associated impacts. But one of our challenges is how do we actually plan for that? This figure here shows how we in past have planned, or what our predictions for population increase is going to be, and what the actual population change has been. So we're quite good at making projections that are quite poor. But of course, we've also got a range of other uncertainties, not just climate change. So population dynamics, the economy, the political environment, which is obviously quite pertinent or salient at the moment for many of us, technology change, different external shocks, also quite salient at the moment. So essentially, when we start thinking about uncertainty, we're talking about this idea that any departure from the achievable ideal of complete determinism, which basically is everything. And the way that people have characterized uncertainty is these different levels. So where we've got level 1, which pretty much we understand what track we're on. Level 3, where you have a series of potential projections or pathways. Level 4, where there's a range, and level 4B, or the far right-hand side, which is really we don't know what's going to happen. And I think this is possibly a good point to say. One of the big challenges is that often we treat the climate scenarios as climate projections. That means that we're treating level 4 uncertainty as level 3 uncertainty. And the risk of doing that is that then we start to use decision-making under uncertainty tools that are completely unsuitable for the type of problem that we're facing, which essentially brings us to the challenge and the point of the conversation. And so we're operating in a space where we have level 4 uncertainty, where essentially we don't know what's going to happen. I had an interesting conversation with a government minister who said, "You all know what the most likely scenario is. Why don't you just say it? It would be so much easier if we could plan." And academics stopped being uncertain and told us what the most likely is. And that's the challenge, is that doing that actually could lead to worse outcomes. So the motivation behind a lot of the deep uncertainty approaches is it's better to be vaguely right than exactly wrong. And so the question that we set out when we started working on this, so when we proposed working on this document that Anita, Patrick, and I wrote, was essentially sorry, I shouldn't have used that acronym. What decision-making under deep uncertainty approach should we use for a given context? So there are a number of different uncertainty tools or deep decision-making under deep uncertainty approaches. But given the context, the resources, the level of value uncertainty or ambiguity, the level of contention within the community or the stakeholders, there are lots of different types of approaches and where one may be more appropriate. So if you haven't come across this document, you can find it on the Deep South Challenge website. And that essentially goes through a range of different DMD approaches, from adaptive planning to dynamic adaptive policy pathways, a number of different what are called computer-assisted reasoning, so essentially simulation approaches, scenario planning, and real options analysis. And I know that Andrew and Graeme are going to talk a little bit about some of these. But the way that we sort of put it together was that we were reviewing we started off by reviewing, this is where I'll dive a little into detail and then I'll step out of it again, is that we took all of the decision-making under deep uncertainty approaches that we're familiar with. There's a taxonomy that has been put together that we're actually in the process of proposing a revision to. But we built that out into what's essentially we classified those. We were trying to figure out which approach to use in in each different context. The way that we did that was started off by essentially categorizing the different approaches. Does it consider generating new interventions, or is it just thinking about what's called policy architecture? Whereas basically, is it a static plan? So you have one single option. Do you have a adaptive plan, which is you have a single series of steps, but not different options? So or do you have a dynamic adaptive plan where you're keeping all of your options open for as long as possible? And so all of those are maybe more or less suitable depending on whether you're working with a community or if you're working with a business or an infrastructure company where the tolerance of the stakeholders varies in terms of their tolerance for uncertainty and open-endedness. So what the document presents is this, what we've called an approach selection key. So essentially, as a planner or a decision maker, this starts to ask some questions that you can work through and think about what are the key, what are some of the decisions that you're wanting to make, and it will suggest an option, an approach that you should use. So, for example, are you wanting to use lots of computer-generated scenarios, or would you like to develop manual scenarios or stories? So that's where you might use scenario planning. If you've got the computer resources, then that might open up alternative options like robust decision-making. Alternatively, do you have the ability to monitor different conditions? Well, that means that you can start to use things like dynamic adaptive planning or dynamic adaptive policy pathways. And if not, then you'll need to take what we call assumption-based planning.
2 minutes, Tom.
Thank you. So I was going to jump onto this slide, so it was a bit bigger, but like I said, this information is available in that document. So in the last 2 minutes, I'm just going to fly through one of the when we're implementing one of these approaches or working alongside one of the councils in New Zealand, and my team at the university and Urban Intelligence works closely with several local government for this purpose. And what we've developed is a software called the Resilience Explorer that lets you sort of zoom in and look at different assets. So if you're thinking from an asset management or a community perspective, you can essentially click on a different asset, consider different hazards, and identify when it might reach some level of consequence. Of course, we have to decide what our tolerance is. So this is an example of that where where the council we're working with has identified whether the consequence is low, moderate, or high. And this is where we then have to start thinking about, well, is this reaching our adaptation threshold? Have we reached an intolerable state? Once we edge towards that, then we need to take an action, which is our trigger, to keep us within an acceptable level of risk. Or we can take a major step, essentially a precautionary approach, and really reduce that risk. So I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, but this is what we're working through is identifying what those thresholds are, what those signals and those triggers are. But one of the challenges that I'm going to end on, and this is the research that we're working through. One of my PhD students, Patrick Curran, is working on this, is how do we handle multiple hazards? A lot of these approaches are set up for single hazards like coastal flooding. Well, how do we think about different interventions or different approaches that can manage how an intervention might change the risk from both coastal flooding and river flooding or groundwater rise or erosion when there's so much complexity? So I'll end on that. There's a lot more to talk about in that space, but the research question that we're working on now, that we're keen to continue engaging with local councils and central government on, is basically how these deep decision-making under deep uncertainty approaches handle this complexity. And with that, I'll hand over to back to Anita.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
That was a nice overview. Thank you. And Zoe has put several links in the chat with more information about that document for those of you who are interested. I don't see any questions yet, so I have one. Tom, in your example that you showed, which looked very interesting, but it wasn't, I was just wondering if you could explain how that approach selection key could be used in that example that you showed.
Yeah.
Or had they got to that point yet, or was it beforehand? I wasn't quite
Yeah,
clear how it related.
So they've made the decision to use dynamic adaptive policy pathways based on the MFE guidance. So before we'd published that guidance.
Okay.
I think, in terms of that is an instance where DAPP or that, yeah, whatever. Dynamic adaptive policy pathways is useful because they have the capacity and willingness to do the monitoring. There's a well-resourced team, and they've got that level of information. There is, of course, the challenge with different hazards, but at the moment, focus being coastal means that, yeah, that complexity is somewhat mitigated.
Right. So do you think having that that document would have changed their decision at all, or would DAP? And sorry, you're right, Zoe, learning the acronyms is the first stage. But as the dynamic adaptive policy pathways, would that have been would that be the method that they would have reached if they'd used that tool or read the document, do you think?
In that case, yes. I think it changes, and it will be interesting to see how, when engaging with the council who are making the decision and with the community, whether or not it ends up boiling down into I really don't like all the different terms, but a protective adaptive where you remove the different options. So you just commit to one of the pathways.
Right.
And I think that I think one of the challenges is that with the current approach to adaptation, we're kind of starting at step 0 and working our way through, where you do your risk assessment, or you do your hazard analysis, you do your risk assessment, then you do adaptation decision making, and then you figure out if that's actually going to be useful in practice. And I think we might be better off and of course it's easy to say this with the benefit of hindsight, is to go backwards through the approach to say, these are the decisions that we're trying to make. do we have the risk assessment to support that? Do we have the hazard information to support that? And that's one of the things that I think is one of the lessons that I've been learning is if you want to set a like a risk tolerance threshold, well, you need to make sure that you've got the right hazard information to make those decisions. And often we don't, because you just model a 1 in 100 year. Well, that's what, a 29% chance within a 30-year period. So qualitatively, like as a risk threshold, it doesn't necessarily mean that much to.
Yeah. Well, I say you've got agreement from the audience from Tom Fitzgerald as well. So that's good. Well, thanks, Tom. And we can hopefully come back to some of this. Sorry, I just was distracted. There's one question come up before we move on. So the selection key is useful. It appears to assume no limits on resources to go down any of these routes. Are there any do minimum approaches that are recommended for those with limited resources? I mean, that is a great question because that is often what it comes down to, isn't it? So maybe if you can just quickly reflect on that, Tom, and then we'll move on to Graeme.
Yeah, so that's like, I think if you had unlimited resources going down like a computer assisted reasoning or like a computer generation or simulation approach. But then like we use scenario planning when those resources are, when there are fewer resources. And then assumption-based planning is probably the minimum that you would do, or what you would do with minimum resources. I think we tried to capture kind of what resources or what constraints were in there, but I'm happy to like bounce around, have a conversation around that with for a specific case.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, well, we might move on to our next speaker, Graeme Guthrie. So Graeme is an independent economist and was previously Professor of Economics and Finance at Victoria University of Wellington. He's written books on real options analysis and corporate governance, and he wrote a document on real options, well, he did a project on real options analysis for climate change adaptation for the Deep South. And I have to say, I was really delighted that Graeme applied his very detailed technical knowledge on real options and finance to climate change adaptation, because this is the kind of expertise that we really need to help us solve some of these questions. So thank you, Graeme. And I'm going to share Graeme's slides because we had some technical issues and hopefully we can see them. I know they're not looking as... Anyway, is it okay like this, Graeme, for you?
That's about as good as you're going to make them look, I think.
Okay.
The limitations are mine, not yours. Don't worry.
Just tell me when to...
I wanted to use the keyboard myself to make it move. So perhaps if you go to the first slide or the next slide.
And now it doesn't want to from my end, but I think it just needs to warm up a little bit. There we go.
Yeah. So that question about the resourcing is actually quite a good place for me to start, because although this was a very technical project, it's really an attempt to deal with a situation where you don't have the resources to do very technical work. So it's sort of quite a natural place to fit in. I'll just give a very high-level definition of real options analysis at the start there. The three parts of it are involved. It's a decision support tool. Well, we know that. It aims to improve current decision-making. We know that. The trick is that it deals with situations in which we know that when we make future decisions, we're going to have more information than we do at the moment. And the question is, how should our current decision-making be influenced by the fact that we don't know what the future is going to hold, but we know that we'll know more about the future when we come to make those future decisions. So it's very much about the flow of information in the future, and about how we respond to that information, and about what that means for what we do today. I know that's a very fluffy definition, but I want to stay away from maths as much as I possibly can here. The point is, when you're confronted with an adaptation problem, I think the thing to do is to ask these three questions that I've listed. So first of all, can we delay some decisions? Will future decision makers have better information about the future than we do? And are the decisions that we take today going to be costly to reverse in the future? And if the answer to those three questions is all yes, then there's potentially a role for real options analysis. And in all the adaptation decisions or projects I've seen, the answer's always been yes to those questions. So real options analysis has a lot to offer, but if you've ever tried to do it, or you've ever commissioned somebody to do it for you, you know that there are problems with it. One is that it's highly technical. Now, finance is a mathematical discipline. Real options analysis comes out of derivative pricing theory, which is probably the most mathematical part of finance. So this is challenging, and it's sort of inevitable that the decision maker is going to be presented with a black box that makes recommendations, and the decision maker really is going to have no idea what's inside that black box. And what makes matters worse is that there are many modeling choices you can make when you carry out real options analysis. Now, that's good from a modeling point of view, because it means you can make your model potentially a very close fit for what's happening in reality. But it makes the black box problem worse, because as a decision maker, it's not just that you know what's in the black box is very technical. It's that you don't really know what's in the black box. You don't know what modeling decisions have been made. You don't know if they're good or not. You don't know if you're comfortable with the assumptions often. It just produces an answer. And then the decision maker has this issue, well, how much do we trust the results? There's some very good real options analysis that's done, and there's some very bad real options analysis that's done. If you do it, you can tell one from the other. If you're a user, you're really vulnerable to that. So those are sort of the problems that come with real options analysis. And if my assistant can flick on to the next slide.
Sorry, Graeme. I'm not a very reliable assistant, it seems. So get very stuck. Okay, sorry.
So this is a description of what I've been trying to achieve with this project. Now, this is a very stylized graph of the cost and benefits of using real options analysis to evaluate an adaptation project. And the horizontal axis there is the project scale. The blue curve are the benefits. The yellow curve is the cost. This isn't the benefit of the project. It's the benefit of using real options analysis to make decisions about the project. So it's the value added, I suppose. And the cost, well, the cost is basically the resources that you're going to have to provide in order to carry out this real options analysis, which gets back to the question we had at the break between presentations. And the idea is that bigger projects will have bigger benefits from real options analysis, but they'll also potentially have higher costs, although probably the benefits are more sensitive to the project scale than the costs are. So if the project is big enough, it's worth incurring, complex enough, then it's worth incurring the cost of carrying out real options analysis. But if you're in that left-hand part of the graph, then the blue curve is still high. So there are still benefits from using ROA, but the costs are so much bigger that it's not worth doing anything. And so you then have the situation where the answers to those three questions are yes. So there's value in doing real options analysis, but not enough value to justify the cost of doing it. So you end up just doing something else and you miss out on those benefits. And that you might think, well, that doesn't matter because the projects are small, but there's an awful lot of small adaptation projects out there. And if you don't do something, those costs will, the lost opportunity is going to add up. So what I'm trying to do is shown on the next slide, which is come up with a technique that has lower cost to implement, but that's it, has lower cost to implement, but still captures some of the benefits of real options analysis. So in an ideal world, I've come up with a project where that yellow dashed curve is close to zero, so it's very easy to implement. And the blue curve is very close to the solid blue curve so that we get most of the benefits of real options analysis. And then what you find is that there's a little grey triangle on the left there. Those are the projects that now justify some sort of real options analysis, not the full bespoke analysis that we had before, but the simplified approach. And we can get some of the benefits of the flexibility that come from these small projects. And if we're lucky, and we go to the next slide, then what you see is that we might actually be able to improve the value added for some of these medium-sized projects, even though they would justify full ROA. It might be better to use something simpler and cheaper to get it. So really what I'm trying to, I'm being told to speed up. This is brilliant.
I didn't mean to do that, Graeme, but
No,
you do actually
I'm
only have
waffling.
2 minutes, so.
I'm waffling, so this is a good discipline. So what I've done is I've looked at 6. I've actually looked at cost benefit analysis, which I'm taking as the sort of baseline approach, and then 5 alternatives. And I've evaluated them. The details are in the full report, but I'm just going to talk through 3 of them here. They work very much the same way in that we evaluate a project at fixed regular intervals, and each time we do an investment test. If it passes that test, then we invest, and if it fails the test, then we wait 5 years, I think in this case, and we come back and we do the test again. And cost benefit analysis, you work out the present value of the benefits. If they're bigger than the present value of the costs, then it's passed the test and you invest. So that's the baseline case. Now, the second method is very similar. The only difference is that when we carry out the test, we use a different discount rate. So in the standard cost benefit analysis, you should be using the social discount rate, which I think Treasury's got several, but I think the relevant one is probably about 5%. Well, with this approach, you use a higher discount rate. You can actually choose anything you want, but there's one that I recommended that's in the full report. There's a formula there that's, well, it's easy if you've got a spreadsheet open to calculate. You need a couple of inputs and you'll get an answer. And there's some examples in that table at the bottom there. So the social discount rate is 5%. You're perhaps adding 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points. And then you just do standard cost benefit analysis. Every 5 years, you calculate the present values of the benefits and the costs. If the benefits are bigger than the costs, you invest. Otherwise, you wait and come back in 5 years' time. And the only difference is that we're using the slightly higher discount rate. And so the third method is easier than it looks or easier than it sounds. It's essentially a pairwise comparison of possibilities that we repeat. The easiest way to describe it is in the bottom of that slide. Imagine we were evaluating a project today. You'd work out the present value of the benefits minus the present value of the costs and say, oh, well, it's positive, so we should invest. Now we do it slightly differently. It's got to be positive, but then we have a second test that it's got to clear. And that is, suppose that we committed now to do this investment in 2 years' time. So work out the present values of the benefits and the costs there, get the net present value. And so in order to pass the investment test, our NPV from today's investment has to be bigger than 0, and it has to be bigger than committing to invest in 2 years' time. If it is, we invest today. If it's not, then we come back in 2 years and we do the whole process again. So we'd now be in 2026, work out the benefit and the costs from investing in 26, and compare that to the present value of the benefits and the costs of investing in 2028, using all the information that's arrived between 24 and 26. And if we fail that test, we come back in 28 and we do it all over again. Now that probably sounds a bit complicated, but if you've done a cost-benefit analysis and you've seen the spreadsheet, you'll know how simple these things are. You basically just shift in your spreadsheet, you shift everything forward a couple of years. So the costs are incurred 2 years later, you lose the first couple of years of benefits, and you do the comparison. Now, if you go to the next slide, Anita, we'll just flick through that very quickly. That's essentially a summary of these 3 approaches. There's hardly any additional information needed over standard CBA, and it's only there to calculate that discount rate. The complexity relative to CBA, well, it depends on your attitude. The first 2 methods aren't more difficult at all. The third one isn't much more difficult. So these 3 methods are all fairly simple to implement. The question is, how well do they perform? Now, if you go to the next slide, this is where that first bullet point is a very large, very technical black box. So what I've done is I've looked at a selection of 3 different types of adaptation project. And I've looked at a whole lot of different combinations for each one, sort of 150 or 200 different settings. And in each of these cases, I've built the model and done what I'm calling the full real options analysis. So this is sort of the gold standard. And I'm doing it so that I can calculate the maximum welfare that we could achieve if we sank the resources into this problem and came up with optimal decision making. And then I take the same model and I say, well, we're not going to use the optimal rule. We're going to use standard cost benefit analysis every 5 years. And so using that rule with that model, I calculate how much welfare we'd get as a result. And
Graeme,
so I can see from there.
soon?
Sorry?
Can we just finish up soon, please?
Yeah, okay. And so we can get the measure of welfare relative to the maximum. I do that the same for the other 2 projects. Now, if you go forward 2 slides, and the next one, yeah, that's the table. Go back one, please. That's it. That's basically the result. Now, if you look at standard cost benefit analysis, and we look at that middle column, which is one of these types of projects, on average, you'll get about 46% of the welfare. So even if you don't do real options analysis, if you do standard CBA at fixed intervals, on average, you'll get about half the maximum potential welfare. But that standard deviation is 12%. And so you might be unlucky and actually do really badly. On average, it'll do okay. But these other 2 methods, just using a different discount rate, on average gets you 97% of the welfare. And if you do my favorite, which is that pairwise comparison, on average, you're getting 99% of the welfare. So this is not much more difficult than cost-benefit analysis, but you're getting almost all of the benefits of real options analysis. And this is across all of these different projects and all of these different parameter values. Now, the next slide is just a summary. I don't think you need to summarize a 10-minute presentation. But if we
maybe we'll stop you there, Graeme. Do you think?
Yeah.
Or just
Can we just go to the next slide, because that's where I want to finish. Basically, what I've done is that blue curve is pretty close to the solid blue curve. So we can get most of the benefits and the costs are really quite low. And so what I'm arguing is that for small projects and perhaps medium-sized projects, these simple techniques can do a pretty good job. But the health warning is there. If it's a big project and it's complex, then you should definitely incur the costs of doing it properly.
Great.
That's me done. Thank you.
Thank you, Graeme. Thank you. And apologies for rushing you along.
That's okay.
Yeah, some very interesting insights there and practical. I'm sure that'll be of a lot of interest to people investing in these appraisals. Yeah, Zoe's suggesting we might need to skip the questions for you because we've eaten into the question time and hopefully we can have some at the end, if that's okay. Thank you. Okay, so our final speaker today is Andrew Allison, and Andrew is a coastal adaptation scientist and modeller at NIWA. He specialises in the interactions between natural and engineered systems. Andrew develops models and tools to improve decision-making in relation to sea level rise, multiple interacting hazards, climate change, and land use change. And Andrew, I'll pass over to you, but also I remember is Judy online and did you want Judy to be involved?
Yes, so Judy is online, and I think Zoe said that she was going to add her to this panel sometime during. I'm presenting, and she can answer questions.
Okay, great. Well, I won't eat it into your time. Go for it.
No worries, thanks. So so Judy lead authored this work. It came out of Deep South National Science Challenge project that we finished back in July. And effectively today I'm going to present an overview of a guidance document that we wrote around applying decision-making under deep uncertainty, DMDU methods, to improve infrastructure adaptation in the coastal space. Oh, there we go. All right, so sea level rise is a chronic ongoing change that will affect many communities in low-lying coastal situations. And we also have extreme events with uncertain magnitude and frequency that are made worse by RSLR. So infrastructure providers' jobs is to service these low-lying communities, but they face difficult choices around how to adapt infrastructure. It's difficult to identify those adaptation thresholds where current and future actions no longer meet their objectives. And it can also be hard to identify lead times of how long it may take to consult, plan on, and implement new actions for infrastructure, and that determines how far in advance you need to make a decision. So we developed a 7-step methodology that allows infrastructure providers and decision makers to reduce some of that uncertainty and better understand the systems that they need to manage. This graphic shows the order in which the 7 steps should generally be used, but that can change due to the circumstances of each application. So the 2 acronyms here stand for Dynamic Adaptive Pathways Planning, DAP, and Robust Decision Making, RDM. So the methodology combines workshops, systems mapping, DAP, exploratory modeling, RDM, and economic analysis to develop and stress test adaptation plans for infrastructure assets. So the 7-step approach doesn't have to be completed in isolation. It can leverage existing work done or planned by infrastructure agencies. For example, one of our case studies used an existing DAP plan, and we tested when the actions would need to be implemented by in order to be effective. So we stress tested that plan. So these 7 methods can be applied to develop and stress test an adaptive plan for any type of coastal infrastructure. While our Deep South project focus was wastewater, we're now using this approach for freshwater provision and assessing the lifespan of transport networks, including state highways. So this figure from our guidance shows the steps for applying our infrastructure adaptation planning methodology. That likely looks very familiar because it's based on and complies with the MFE Coastal Hazards and Climate Change Guidance 10-step decision cycle. So stage 1 focuses on understanding what's happening. Stage 2 focuses on what matters most. Stage 3 focuses on identifying what we can do about it. Stage 4 focuses on developing and implementing the adaptive strategy. And stage 5 focuses on monitoring and adjusting the adaptive plan. So the focus of this talk and the core of our guidance is on step 3, identifying and evaluating the options and pathways, but the guidance does cover all of the 5 stages. So a system mapping exercise developed and done in a stakeholder workshop can provide a visual representation of the infrastructure system and the environmental, regulatory, social, and economic drivers and constraints on its adaptation. So the system map developed should be regularly referred to during the remaining steps to ensure that the modelling and analysis are accounting for all the necessary variables. The system map can also be updated after DAP development to include adaptation thresholds and adaptive actions. So the map shown on screen is one of our case studies from the Adaptitools project, the Seaview wastewater treatment plant, and it shows critical connections within the system. So the central boxes are linked by pipes through the trunk network, the Seaview wastewater treatment plant and the outfall pipeline, and the movement of wastewater through the system. Blue arrows show the influence of one variable on another. The top boxes show triggers. Black arrows show the drivers that may lead to triggers being reached. Red arrows show options for adaptive actions for each trigger. Orange arrows show where actions are implemented in the system, and yellow arrows show secondary actions that are required if a primary action is implemented. So most people here, I'd say, are already well aware of DAP. DAP is used for anticipating risk where we need to make decisions today to avoid lock-in of maladaptation, because risks change over time and increasing flexibility is needed to adopt different outcomes and pathways. So components of a DAP should be considered and assembled using a workshop with the infrastructure provider or other stakeholders. The components include adaptation thresholds, actions and options, lead times, indicators, and triggers. So once that's developed, we code the DAP into a spatially explicit temporally dynamic model. So this fits the computer-assisted reasoning type of DMDU that Tom mentioned. So effectively, we force these simulation models with combinations of the 5 RCP, SSP scenarios. In this case, we use 3 influence scenarios and manual and automatic implementations of the DAP plan. So the models simulate the implementation of the DAP with new actions chosen when triggers are reached in order to avoid adaptation thresholds. That's the intent. And we run either Monte Carlo analyses or Latin hypercube sampling. Basically, you just run the model tens or hundreds of thousands of times to understand all the possible outcomes in the system. And through that process, we can determine the feasibility of adaptive actions and the lifespan of the assets. So in this case, it was the lifespan of the plant, the trunk network, and the outfall pipelines. So while a DAP offers a range of actions and potential pathways that can be followed, it doesn't explicitly show which sequence of options should be followed to meet multiple, sometimes competing objectives that infrastructure providers need to meet under an array of different possible futures. So robust decision-making is used under conditions of uncertainty, and it runs a model many times to stress test proposed options and pathways against a range of plausible futures, rather than using computer models and data as a predictive tool. So rather than being about optimization and finding the best pathway, RDM focuses on finding pathways that are the most robust. So that's the pathways that are least likely to fail, regardless of what happens. So regardless of what climate trajectory we follow, regardless of what socioeconomic trajectory we end up following. And so the model, therefore, once you've developed that, you need to run it in stages. It's simpler than it sounds. But first, you run it to identify the physical and temporal locations of adaptation thresholds in the case of business as usual, with no adaptive actions being taken. Secondly, you run the model with the DAP options and pathways operating to see if implementation of the DAP can avoid the adaptation thresholds and to see if the timing of triggers is appropriate or if they need to be adjusted. Thirdly, you run it to identify actions that are robust and actions that are not. So non-robust actions should be removed from the DAP because they're not fit for purpose under this method. Then fourth, the model should be run with the adjusted DAP operating to see if its implementation can now avoid all adaptation thresholds. And if so, you can identify numerically trigger values and timings along with the range of actions available once an E-trigger is reached. And if not, you need to go for another iteration of removing non-robust actions and repeat step 4 again. But what you get at the end of it, the pathways that emerge are archetypes of adaptation, so sequences of adaptive actions that achieve performance and operational objectives. And the end product is a stress-tested DAP that is robust against that future uncertainty. So it doesn't need to resolve uncertainty, it just, what you end up with is a product that works regardless of that uncertainty. And the final step in the analysis is an economic analysis, which should be undertaken on the robust pathways to price the costs of those. That can be done using a lot of different methods, multi-criteria analysis, real options analysis, as we've just heard about, cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis. It really each have different complexities and merits and should be chosen based on the requirements of the organization who you're developing these plans for. And this step can provide decision makers with information on investment costs, maintenance and operation and transfer costs, benefit of avoided damage, residual loss, the cost of benefit of delaying implementation, and non-monetary costs and benefits. So in summary, basically the 7 methods facilitate holistic, accurate, and robust modeling and analysis. Adaptation options can be stress tested for their robustness under different scenarios: climate change, sea level rise, socioeconomic scenarios. And in doing so, this approach gives decision makers greater confidence as to the options and how they work. Are they viable? How long do they last for under different circumstances? And that allows decision makers to avoid lock-in and path dependency, which are forms of maladaptation. And therefore, in doing this all and using lots of different DMDU methods in tandem, we can give greater uncertainty under conditions of deep uncertainty. The question remains is how to get this implemented in organizations, because one, it is quite technical and it can seem as a black box to people, which is why the workshop part of this process is really important, is engaging with the organization the whole way through and working with them, showing them the results, explaining how it works. It was quite successful under this project, and as I say, we're using it again for new organizations now. And adaptive planning, it is gaining traction in the Australian and New Zealand water sector, and that's being steered by government guidance, executive agencies, and water utilities. And while deep uncertainty has been known to cause what people have called analysis paralysis, adaptive planning can help overcome this by keeping all the options on the table, and DMDU methods can resolve much of the uncertainty and work with what uncertainty remains. And so also what we found is that highlighting successful implementation of this approach, or these approaches, different DMDU approaches, can build confidence in adaptive approaches. And as a result, they are being more widely implemented across the sector. And that's me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a fascinating project, and I really appreciated during the course of that project that you held some workshops to share some of these techniques with academics and local government people who were interested, and that was really valuable. So I think, oh, there's Judy. Hi, Judy. We've got one question here already, and please feel free to type in other questions. We've got about 7 minutes for them. So I guess this question would apply to everyone, but Andrew and Judy, I'll give you the opportunity to answer first, which is great to see a variety of tools available for decision making under uncertainty. 2 questions. 1, who are the intended users for each of the tools, and what level of technical expertise do you expect is needed to run each? So I'll just let you answer based on your own project first, Andrew and Judy.
Well, the level of technical expertise, it doesn't necessarily need to be held within the organization. So they need to be able to understand the process that technical people are running through to be able to use these DMDU tools, but they don't need to be proficient in it themselves. As I say, running this in a workshop setting and kind of doing an end-to-end process really helped us build that trust with the organizations to the extent that there is ongoing work with a number of different organizations as a result of this. Judy, you may wish to. You're muted.
Judy, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. Yeah, I think the benefit of for organisations for using this is that it can be scaled, and it can be used for scoping at the beginning of a process, and you can use DAP Lite to do that. So you can use a scorecard approach and get a feel, if you like, for what the possible options might be and where that could take you. And then you can decide whether to go through a more complex process. But using RDM has been developed where it can be used rapidly on computers, and having access to somebody to work alongside, I think, is important as people learn how to use it.
Thanks. Graeme, I feel like your whole presentation was a little bit about this, but if you wanted to add anything in terms of the level of technical expertise and the intended users for yours, feel free to answer.
Yeah, there's not much to say really, except I think it's intended for organisations that would hopefully be using some sort of cost-benefit analysis anyway to make their decisions. It's what can you do to get them closer to getting real options benefits. So it's sort of or it may be that when you hire your consultants to do it, you don't pay them to do the full Monty. You pay them to do no. We just have this sort of slight extension of CBA. So it's designed to be, anyone who's sort of got a spreadsheet there for their cost benefit analysis and is doing it, it's an embellishment of that rather than throwing it out and starting again. That's sort of what it's aimed at.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And Tom, do you want to reflect quickly on that? We sort of maybe did already.
Yeah, well, only that it's the whole range, and I feel like as Graeme and Judy said and Andrew said, each of their approaches has there's like the really intense version, and often there are lighter versions, but that's part of the challenge, that there is a level of understanding that all of the tools need. But that's where the challenge is trying to support that.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective as well, it's partly also just getting awareness among organisations, isn't it? That there are these ways to make better decisions than maybe what currently are being used, and then it's supporting them and using it. So we've only really got a couple of minutes left. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I wondered, maybe Judy, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah,
don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. One thing that occurred to me when I was listening to you, Tom, was the fact that these are not either or, they're and. And so the techniques can be used together. They have been applied together. So multi-criteria analysis, DAP and RDM can be worked together with ROA.
Yeah, that's
in different ways. And I think that that's quite a, people listening need to realise that why we're doing this, which is that the nature of our problems are uncertain. They're not static problems, and the change is occurring over time. So we need techniques that actually can take that into account. Otherwise, it's the old story that, scenarios are useful, but they're not going to give you the right answer. And I think, Tom, you made that point, and so did you, Graeme. So, we need to be real that just by running one scenario or running one technique is not going to give us the right answer, because there is no right answer, because at the end of the day, judgments have to be exercised as well once you've got this information. So it's not just going to be a sausage machine. So we come out with an answer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I hope that this has provided some food for thought. I think did we get cut off, Zoe, at 12 or no? Okay, so Tom, you were going to say something.
Only that I think the hardest part is getting people into the mindset, into the headspace of uncertainty, rather than like, this is the optimal solution. And that goes for not just communities and state and councillors, but also like business boards, and government ministers that want that projection.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is scary, but you do still hear that quite a lot.
Could I just add one thing, Anita? One way of doing that, which we found extremely useful when we introduced DAP into New Zealand initially, was using serious games where people had no skin in the game, and they could explore different things, get feedback, and that enabled them to get their heads into thinking about, well, yeah, if I make the wrong decision, this is the consequence, and work through 100 years of planning to see how that affects your decision making. And so we found that extremely useful, and some of that is included in the coastal guidance, but it's also useful for other uncertainty situations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we probably need to wrap it up there. I hope this has provided some food for thought for those online. I'd really like to thank our speakers very much for doing the work, and then for being willing to come and present it here. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. And as we said, this is the last Deep South webinar ever. It's quite strange, but the whole challenge ends on Sunday. So we'd really, I guess, like to acknowledge all the work that's gone on in the Deep South, and all of you who contributed to that. And there's still a lot of, all our material will be available on the website for some time to come. And I will just close with a karakia and let you go on with your day. Te mauri o te hui ka ea, te mauri o te wānanga ka ea, koa ki runga, koa ki raro, haumie hui taike. Thank you very much. What do we do now?